going to have questions after each of the papers, again, because we only have two. And so the floor is now open for questions, comments, responses of any sort. And first, I want to thank you for an incredibly exciting paper that's opening a lot of avenues. I've been interested in the links between Boethius and Moore, but I have been thinking in Moore's writing, and this brings us forward in a very intriguing and exciting way. So, questions from comments? It's a lot to absorb. Yes, Mary.
I would like to ask you something. It interests me so much that this great flood of translation which you've described in a very short period. Number one, we can't do a translation overnight, so there must be people working on these, thinking about them, before they were actually published. And I also want to ask you, commercially, were they a success? It was interesting, a great deal. These are very scholarly works that have been published in English, which wasn't the language of scholarship at that time. That implies a wide readership among the aristocracy, educated aristocracy.
Or among, well, the sort of upper middle classes as well.
Yes,
yes. That time.
Yes. I mean, that's very interesting. Were they commercially successful? Do we know?
Grimmel's translation certainly was, very much so. It remained the standard version for the next at least 150 years. It was reprinted innumerably. There was, I think the second edition arrived immediately 2 years later or so. So Grimmel's version was indeed a bestseller. Perhaps more for its educational value than for its political echoes. I wouldn't contend that this was an ideological text or a political text. It was very much a mainstream educational text. It was used as a standard text in many Tudor schools later on, and Shakespeare must have studied it, so it really remained the standard version. The same is true for the Utopia. As we know, Tottle's edition was the second, and there were 3 more editions to come, an Elizabethan one and then 2 more Caroline ones. Brende's Curtius was also fairly successful. There were 3 more editions, I think. And we do not know a lot about the Colville-Boetius translation. I think there are 2 more editions or so recorded, but they don't exist anymore, so we don't know anything about that. But many of these translations were successful precisely due to the fact that they made accessible the classics for the first time to a wider readership, not just academics, but really a wider, either aristocratic or middle class readership of students. And this was a trend which had started earlier, of course, as early as well, the decades after Moore's death, with Thomas Eliot and then Thomas Paynell. Thomas Paynell's first translation was published in 1531, I think, and he had a wide range of texts that he translated. But what interests me about the Marian translations in particular is that, to me, they seem to form a kind of bridge between the official political and religious discourse and the literary works that were published, like Tottle's Miscellany and others. And they also did a lot for the English language, of course. Grimmel's preface is famous for promoting English as a literary language that is capable of transmitting the classics, and so does the preface to Tottle's Miscellany, so does the preface to the Rastal works of Moore. So there seem to be common, I'm reluctant to call it an agenda, but there seem to be common concerns in the literary culture of the period that are broader than just religion and
There was an
promoting the
appetite for
Marian
reading in
agenda.
English, yes.
Sorry.
There was an appetite for reading in English, which was comparatively new.
Yeah.
Yes. That's very, very interesting. Thank you. Elliot.
Yes, well, thank you, Gabriela. The issues that were involved in Marian translation seem to take Thomas More as the author of Utopia and as an author of the works written presumably in the power. That seems to be an almost standard paradigm for our own contemporary criticism of war, which focuses on those periods rather than the extensive periods of its religious polemics. Now, the Marian period did have a vested interest in More's defense of Catholicism and doctrine. Did any of the Marians actually capitalize on what More had said vis-a-vis these prominent figures who had been still living when the Marian period was going on?
You mean on his religious polemics?
Religious, on the religious side of it. It was this question because
Yeah.
all of these books deal with More as a philosopher,
Sure.
as a humanist, as a wiki scholar, and so on, rhetorician, and so on. But the bulk of his works, in terms of number of pages, had to do with religious aspects.
Sure. I mean, More's religious polemics were really used in the official discourse. They were used in Russell's life to defend More's status as a martyr, as a cultural icon, as a bulwark of Catholicism, really. So they were very much part of the official political religious discourse, which I deliberately didn't want to focus on because it's been written about quite a lot, and it's been commented on recently, increasingly through Eamon Duffy's work, and there's been more recent works by David Loads and Paul Wiseman. But what interests me here is actually to revise the picture of More in the Marian period as we know it. We tend to think that what the Marian period wanted to foreground was precisely his role as an anti-Reformation polemicist and as a martyr, and that his role as a humanist was somehow sort of moved to the sidelines a little bit. And what I wanted to show is that through these texts, it's clear that this was not the case, that his status as a humanist, as an eloquent writer of Latin and English literature was equally important than his stance as a religious polemicist. I'm not sure whether I answered your question.
Thank you.
Martin.
Thank you for your splendid presentation, Gabriela. Which differences and similarities, and/or similarities, do you see between the reception of Thomas More in the Marian period and the reception of Thomas More in the Elizabethan reign?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, in the Elizabethan period, we have the problem that More's martyrdom became problematic again. Of course, we have John Fox, who heavily polemicizes against More, who highlights, well, he expresses his respect for More, but basically says his final stance was foolish. That was his big mistake. So we might think that the Elizabethan period had kind of to roll back from the image that the Marian period had established. There are some similarities, I think, in the way that More's integrity as a statesman has always been important. His humanism has been important, as I was trying to show. If you read the play of Thomas More, for example, the book of Thomas More, it's almost entirely concerned with More's justice, with his integrity as a judge, as a statesman, and that is certainly taken from the Harpsfield biography and the other biographical accounts that were written during the Marian period. It's just the emphasis that changes away from the religion again and back to the politics.
Could you also think of Shakespeare's Richard III as drawing on earlier
More's history?
Really shaped, in a sense, by More's history of Europe? Because Richard III is just such a tyrant and such a master of manipulation. He's a classic example of tyranny, which has been picked up again recently in Stephen Greenblatt's study of tyrants, with unnamed, maybe named, I haven't read the book, just a review of a certain American leader. But that seems a continuity in a way too.
Yeah, well, the Shakespearean parallels with American politics have been highlighted quite extensively, I think. Yeah, I mean, More's history was, of course, Shakespeare's main source via Moore's Chronicles for his Richard III. What he seems to me to do is he picks up More's main plot, more or less, but he focuses much more heavily on Richard as the central figure, as a tyrant who even boasts about his own villainy, his tyranny. So much of Shakespeare's play is centered on the theatrical effect of Richard, who even becomes sympathetic to some audiences, I think, because he's so theatrically convincing. And I think More's account is much more complex, it's more ironical, it's more ambiguous when it comes to the causes of what happened, when it comes to reflecting on general mechanisms of public reaction and manipulation. So I think Shakespeare, to a certain extent, simplifies More a little bit, but he does that to great theatrical effect.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gabriela. I wonder if, I know this was sort of outside your brief, but if you could talk a little bit about the treatment of More's sort of legal works, his controversies with Christopher German, who, even though it kind of shades into the ecclesial controversies, it could easily stand apart. Did those works receive any sort of treatment in the Marian time as a notion for the removal of royal supremacy and the separation of the legal enterprise from the church?
I must admit I haven't really looked closely at the discussions of the polemical works. So yes, I'm sure they have. I mean, I'm sure Harpsfield discusses them in the biography, and they are, of course, printed in Raskell's volume as well. But I'm just not very much aware of the legal, specifically legal discourse after.
Yes. I liked you mentioning that Thomas More the humanist was more celebrated than Thomas More the martyr in those days. And I was surprised myself when I turned to that period in the review I'm going to do just after you, that in fact he was first a humanist, the writer of Utopia, or especially like 20 years after his death. And this surprised me. And I didn't go into that as closely as you did, but I made the same concept, yes. Interesting.
Well, I wouldn't say that the humanist was more important than the martyr in the Marian period. The martyr was very much more visible. That's for sure. The martyr and the religious controversialists were the visible more. They were prominently presented at public occasions, in polemic treatises and so forth. And the humanist was a little bit less prominent, less visible, but I would argue equally crucial to the argument. And it was there in those more hidden references and allusions. And before that, under Edward VI, for example, when Robinson's Utopia was published, it was of course crucial to foreground the humanist and downplay the religious implications. That wouldn't have been possible.
Obviously that was of course the case for Protestant plays. Some were really against Thomas More and took him for a fool, but others wanted to celebrate Thomas More the humanist or the London hero. I'm going to talk about that, like I won't replicate too much. But they tried to forget that he'd been a Catholic martyr. They just wanted a hero, so they took the hero they had. And they thought he was a humanist, so that's good enough. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. Don't you think it is interesting that the first translation of Utopia into English was not under Mary, but rather in the last years of Edward VI, 1551. And also, in one of the pictures that you showed on the screen, there were close similarities in between two works, the editions of two works, the translation of the Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation and the History of Quintus. And
Quintus Curtius.
yeah, that's it. Maybe there's no much sense in what I'm about to say, but instead of assuming that there might be intended reasons behind these similarities, well, it might be the case simply that editors and printers had this set of plates and engravings for the different editions, and it was simply that the editor used the same one for both books, because
By coincidence, you think? Or for commercial reasons?
Not necessarily so, but simply that these
Recycling.
Excuse me?
Recycling.
Recycling, maybe recycling, because I remember that the plate, I don't know the name, the exact technical word for that, but the plate, the engraving that was used for the first edition of Margaret Moore's translation of Erasmus, of a woman reading or writing, is used in other books as well. So
Yeah, Hertz translation of Vives, for example, I think.
that's it, that's it.
Yeah.
So it might be simply case, these are the ones I have, I'm going to use them again and again, rather than assuming that there is a kind of ideological intention behind.
Purpose. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't like to imply or to read an agenda, you know, into every coincidence of title pages. Of course, a lot of this was commercial, a lot of this was just financial reasons, recycling title page borders and so forth. But I find it interesting to see how printers, for example, appropriate title page borders that printers before them had used. And this one in particular, maybe.
Yes.
And this one, but in particular, for example, had been used before by Reinhard Wolff when publishing a Protestant polemic called Piers the Plowman's. Well, it was a rereading, an adaptation of Chaucer's of Piers Plowman. Piers the Plowman's Creed, I think it was called, and it was a Protestant piece of polemic. And interestingly, Tottel takes exactly this title page from Wolff, uses it for the Dialogue of Comfort, and probably shortly afterwards, I'm not exactly sure when the Courtiers was published, whether before the Dialogue of Comfort or afterwards, but I assume that it must have been shortly afterwards,
Right.
for the Courtiers. So this makes me wonder, I mean, this is a very elaborate, sumptuous title page border. It's not one of those standard ones that you also see, you know, that were used probably without any clear purpose. And it depicts, for example, I've written about this elsewhere, it depicts the scene from Ovid's Metamorphoses on Pyramus and Thisbe. Pyramus and Thisbe is the etiology in the Metamorphoses of the mulberry tree. And the Latin name of mulberry tree is morbus. So, I mean, I just can't think that this was just chosen randomly, and I do think that the association that I mean, it might just have been whatever economy or laziness. We happened to print that translation at the same time, so we just used the same border. Why not? But still, it does create a public image, and it does visibly associate those two books. So I do tend to think that there was some intentionality behind it in this case, as with the Eliot and the Grimont translation.
And about the translation of the Utopia in the very last years of Edward VI.
Ah, yeah, sorry, yeah.
Don't you
Sure.
think that is interesting as well?
That is very
Thomas More as a humanist, as the author of Utopia.
Yeah.
Something that might not be problematic. Less than 20 years after the execution.
Sure, that's interesting too, and a lot has been written about why the Utopia was exactly published in 1551, what its political purpose might have been. There is even a passage in the preface where Robinson excuses his author and says, well, he was an excellent scholar and politician, but if it hadn't been for that last flaw, for that last blunder, he would have been flawless, something like that. I can't remember the exact passage, but he's excusing, he's downplaying More's martyrdom.
Thank you.
But yeah, and he's of course foregrounding more the humanist and also the political character of the Utopia as a treatise on the good nature of the best nature of the Commonwealth. And there are also interesting political implications that one might look at in the last years of Protected Sons.
Jerry and Seymour both had questions.
Yeah. Actually, this is just more of a comment, but you might want to respond anyway, because on the one hand, I had a similar sort of thought that, you know, given that More is working in this rather robust commonplace tradition, to what extent are these resonances maybe not so much echoes of More, or just rather echoes of commonplaces about how to write about a martyr? So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, your scholarship is so meticulous. You know, you're finding such precise connections. You know, fair enough, yeah, I mean, there was a fairly narrow margin for profit in the book trade, so they would recycle. But as these coincidences mount up, it does seem like, well, this is very, very, as you say, interesting. And you even in your presentation gave a kind of qualifier saying, you know, there's no documentary proof, but I think it's a fair speculation. And I think it is. So, you know, I think it's helpful to you know, take into account these, you know, possibilities of critique. You know, it's commonplace. You know, it was commonplace also to recycle, and yet it seems to me this is well worth plowing ahead with. You know, I mean, it sounds like there may be a book in this, or if not several. So that was just my comment.
Thank you. Seymour.
This is kind of an echo in defense of looking at borders. I agree with you. You do recycle if you notice one of the ways.
So the right word is borders, right?
Yeah, borders. So those woodcuts are, you can see they're cracked in places and they don't transmit the ink, and so they track how old the things are, and can we get another printing out of this one, or do we have to like reuse it? There's a good example of it's a work by Luke Shepard published in 1548, and it's called John Bond and Masked Parsons. It's a pamphlet really, but he bought Lincoln Ward's stock, and he uses, ironically, the same borders for the life of St. Benedict that show a Corpus Christi procession to have another work that condemns Corpus Christi processions. So the message, and I think you look at Andrew Pettigree's work on Brand Luther, that's really tells you this whole story is like, what does that look like? You don't even have to read the text. For some readings, printers are that exact. But other printers casually recycle, and it doesn't really matter, because I got to get a woodcut, let's put it in and crank it out. Quite literally crank it out.
What strikes me, it's similar but different context, is that devotional works were translated and published. The same text was published by both Protestants and Catholics, and all they did was cross out the references that they objected to. So, Helen White talks about this a long time ago in her study of books of devotion. And so there was a kind of interesting interchange of things that would seemingly be one-sided, but weren't. And I mean, really a lot of commonality between devotions. So that is almost highlighted when you see what the Protestants crossed out and the Catholics put back. So you could trade and.
Or another interesting field to look at would be uses of the Church Fathers, by both Protestants and Catholics.
Yes.
In
fact, I mean, if you think of Hooker, Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, I mean, he's using a lot of the Church Fathers. Sure. So this strain of humanism, which is something that does interest me, that when you read casual histories, they sometimes act as if humanism was a very small period at the beginning. And I noticed that particularly with Margaret Roker, the way they treat her, because she was a humanist, and somehow in recent studies of women, they're discarding her, and they're starting early modern at 1540 instead of 1500. So the humanist period is getting shunted out. And so what you're showing is how this humanism continues, which I think is really important, because it's gotten lost, it seems to me, in some literary studies, oddly. So I know we won't have time for Marie Claire's, but do we have one more question?
We will have time. We'll have plenty of time.
Oh, okay.
We'll even have
maybe just briefly one comment on Seba's comment or question. Because one thing is on the discussion here generally. One thing is the intentionality. We can probably never be ultimately sure whether the printer used a border intentionally or just by coincidence or for commercial reasons. But another perspective that interests me is another question that we might ask is, what does this do with readers? I mean, it does create visible associations, and it will make at least certain readers who perhaps happen to know both works, it will make them associate those works with each other. So even if the resemblance wasn't intentional, it does change the way that the text is received in certain respects.
I'd like to ask, you notice the sort of, was the humanist or polemical martyrdom most undermined? Is it something to do with disinterest? If you're a peasant, you may be rather concerned more with martyrdom than your eternal soul. Are you really going to be worrying about humanist concerns? I suspect the answer is no. And was it a way to do with illiterate people in the 1550s who were concerned with humanist questions and ideas that martyrdom, and More's martyrdom was more, not exclusively, but more the sole concern of poorer people. Is there any element of education in this?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I guess poorer people wouldn't have had access to books anyway. The sources they would have
concern.
no. What the common people probably would have heard were perhaps the popular sermons, the public sermons on feast days, or even at the burnings. They would have read pamphlets, or they would have heard about pamphlets, perhaps. So I mean the medium where a certain image is transmitted, of course, has implications for the readership or for the group it is directed towards. And I guess those translations were directed at a readership that wasn't specifically academic, but it was an educated readership nonetheless.
Martin?
Did you ever come across an element that's pointing to personal sympathy? Queen Elizabeth I felt for Thomas More because she got a very strong humanistic schooling, and in the end, both her mother and Thomas More died in completely the same way, by the hand of the same king.
I'm not aware of any personal statements by Elizabeth. I don't know if anybody's aware of how she personally reacted.
She did translate Boethius.
Yeah.
So I don't know if she had read earlier translations. I don't know if she read the Dialogue of Comfort.
I don't know. I mean, she and Mary were educated together for a while, weren't they? So she might have.
I think it's very possible that she could have read the Utopia in Latin.
Probably.
Because she was a good Latinist, and she delivered her addresses in Latin. So there's no reason at all why she couldn't have, because she had humanist tutors. I mean, that is one strain of humanism that continues because of her tutors.
Yeah, I mean, she must have been aware of More as the decent public image had him as a humanist from the statesman, but I'm not aware of any sources that would tell us about her personal estimation of him.
She was a tiny baby when he was executed, so she wasn't aware of him in her own lifetime.
Sure.
It's just given the kind of education she and her sister both had, they probably both read Utopia, and I mean, they could well have read more books by More, because he would have been a good contemporary Latin writer. And her tutors might well have given her more Latin to read than English. I have to leave it at that. I'm not a specialist. Other questions?
I suggest we have a 10-minute break, perhaps.
Well, can we thank